My daughter moved back in on a Thursday in November, and by the following spring, I was eating dinner alone in my own bedroom with the door locked. But she didn't know that on the morning she screamed at me and threw my late husband's coffee mug against the wall, I was already 3 steps ahead of her. She came downstairs that Sunday, expecting silence and submission. What she found instead made her hands shake so badly she dropped her car keys twice trying to pick them up off the floor. But to understand how we got to that morning, you need to know who I am first. My name is Patricia Wellett. I'm 67 years old, a retired school teacher, and I live in a red brick house on a quiet street in Kingston, Ontario. The kind of street where your neighbors still wave from their driveways, where somebody always notices if your porch light hasn't been on in a few days. I taught grade 4 for 31 years at the same elementary school 2 blocks from where I was born. I know this town the way you know a hymn you've been singing since childhood, every word, every pause, every place where the melody lifts. My husband Raymond passed 6 years ago, prostate cancer, slow and then very fast, the way it so often goes. We were married for 38 years. He was a quiet man, steady as stone, the kind of man who fixed things without being asked, and never once raised his voice to me, not even in our worst arguments. After he went, I grieved hard for about 2 years, the way I think you're supposed to. And then I rebuilt. Slowly, deliberately. I started my garden again. I had friends over for tea. I joined the library's Tuesday reading group. I learned to be alone without being lonely. It was a harder lesson than anything I ever taught a child, but I learned it. My daughter Sophie is 39. She works in marketing, or she did, until the company downsized and let her go 14 months ago. Before that, she lived in Toronto with her boyfriend Marcus, a condo downtown, a life that looked polished from the outside. When she called me in November to say things had fallen apart, the job, the relationship, the condo lease, all ending within the same 6 weeks, I didn't hesitate for a single second. "Come home," I said. "Take your time. We'll figure it out together." I genuinely believed that. I want you to know that before I tell you the rest. She arrived with 4 suitcases, a box of kitchen gadgets she never used, and a bitterness in her face I told myself was just exhaustion. I made up her old bedroom. I stocked the pantry with the things she liked. I didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. I gave her space. I gave her time. I gave her everything I had learned a grieving person needs. The first month was quiet. She slept late. She scrolled on her phone. She ate the meals I cooked without much comment, sometimes without a word at all, sliding her plate into the dishwasher and disappearing back upstairs. I told myself, she's healing. This is what healing looks like. I taught children for 3 decades. I knew what it looked like when someone had gone very quiet inside themselves. I was patient. I was kind. I was her mother. I don't know exactly when the atmosphere in the house changed. It wasn't one moment. It was more like the way winter comes, not in a single storm, but in a slow, steady dropping of temperature until one morning you realize the ground is frozen solid and you can't remember the last time it wasn't. She started making small comments about the house too cluttered, too old-fashioned, too much of Raymond everywhere, about my cooking too heavy, too much sodium, about my routines. "You go to bed at 9, Mom, do you know how depressing that is?" I let them pass. She was struggling. People say unkind things when they're struggling. Then she started rearranging things. She moved the furniture in the living room without asking me, pushed Raymond's reading chair into the corner by the window where the afternoon light would bleach the fabric. I moved it back. She moved it again. I didn't say anything. I moved it back again. The money came next. She'd been collecting employment insurance, about $500 a week, which in Kingston can go a fair distance if you're not paying rent. She wasn't paying rent. She wasn't contributing to groceries. She wasn't paying for utilities. I wasn't asking her to, not yet, not while she was still on her feet. But when I gently mentioned, around the 3-month mark, that it might be nice if she could pitch in even a small amount for food, she looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something deeply unreasonable. "I'm literally not working, Mom. I have nothing." "But you have EI, I said, "and that's more than—" "That's my money," she said flatly, and walked out of the kitchen. Her moods became unpredictable in a way that exhausted me. Some mornings she'd be soft, almost like her old self, making us both tea, sitting at the table, telling me stories about Toronto that made us both laugh. Those mornings I'd breathe again and think, there she is, there's my girl. And then by afternoon something would shift, something invisible I could never identify, and she'd be cold and cutting, and I'd spend the evening walking carefully around the edges of whatever I'd apparently done wrong. My friend Dorothy, who has been my closest friend since we both taught at the same school 20 years ago, came over for lunch one Wednesday in February. We sat in the kitchen and she looked at me the way old friends look at each other, the way that means I see exactly what's happening and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. "Patty," she said, "how long has it been since you had someone over for dinner?" I thought about it. The reading group had met at my house in October, just before Sophie came back. Nothing since. "You love having people here," Dorothy said quietly. "This was your place. You and Raymond made this a warm house. What's happened to it?" I didn't have a good answer for her. That was the first time I really let myself see what had been happening, not as a series of separate small incidents, but as a pattern. A slow, deliberate narrowing of my own life inside my own home. Things got worse through March. Sophie had started job searching in earnest, which I supported entirely, but the searching seemed to leave her angrier rather than more hopeful. Every rejection email darkened her mood for days. She began to make pointed comments about Raymond's pension, which I'd been living carefully within for 6 years. "That house must be worth nearly $500,000 now," she said once, not quite looking at me. $500,000 just sitting there. I felt something cold move through me when she said that, but I pushed it down. She didn't mean it the way it sounded. She was frustrated. She was frightened. The morning it broke open completely was a Sunday in early April. I had been up since 6:30, as I always am. I'd made coffee, done the crossword, watered the seedlings on the kitchen windowsill that I was planning to transplant to the garden once the frost risk passed. Around 9, Sophie came downstairs, and immediately the air in the room changed. I could feel it before she spoke a word. She opened the fridge, stood there looking into it for a long moment, and then turned around. "Did you use my oat milk again?" I hadn't. I told her so. "It's half gone, Mom. It was almost full 2 days ago." I said I'd bought an identical carton 2 weeks back, and perhaps she was thinking of that one. She wasn't interested in that explanation. She closed the fridge harder than she needed to and stood there with her arms crossed, and what came out of her mouth in the next several minutes was something that I don't think I will ever fully stop hearing, not at some cellular level. She said that I was careless with her things, that I never listened, that I never respected her space or her choices, that I was the reason her father hadn't been happy, the reason the family was the way it was, the reason she'd never felt truly at home in her own childhood. She brought up things I hadn't thought about in decades and recast them in the worst possible light, every memory distorted, every sacrifice erased. I stood very still. My hands were on the counter behind me, holding the edge, and then she picked up Raymond's mug, the dark blue one, the one that said "World's Best Grandpa," that our granddaughter Maisie had given him as a joke because he was never technically a grandfather, but always acted like one to the children of our friends, and she threw it against the plaid wall. It didn't shatter all at once. It broke into 3 large pieces and 1 smaller one. The sound was not loud, but it was permanent, the kind of sound that doesn't leave a room. She stood there breathing hard, and then she walked past me and went upstairs. I looked at the pieces on the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything. I stood there for a long time and I thought about Raymond, about how he would have looked at me across that kitchen if he'd been here, that quiet, steady look he had, that look that meant, "I see what's happening, and I trust you to know what to do." I bent down slowly, and I picked up every piece. I didn't go back to bed. I put the kettle on, and while the water heated, I went to the phone. I want to tell you something about the calls I made that morning, because I think people imagine these moments as dramatic, as something large and declarative. They aren't. I was in my bathrobe in my own kitchen at 9:15 on a Sunday morning, and I was terrified. Not of Sophie, not physically, not then. I was terrified of what I was about to put into motion. Because once you make certain calls, you are no longer protecting the story you've been telling yourself. You are telling a different, truer, more painful one. The first call was to Dorothy. She picked up on the second ring. I heard the television in her background, one of those Sunday morning news shows she likes. "I need to tell you something," I said, "and I need you to come for breakfast next Sunday." Dorothy, in the way of old friends, didn't ask me to explain the whole thing over the phone. She asked me one question. "Are you safe?" I said yes. She said, "What time?" I said 10 o'clock. She said she'd be there, and then she said, "Patty, you know what I want to see when I walk in that door?" I said, "What?" "I want to see you sitting at the head of your own table," she said, "not standing in the corner of it." I started to cry a little then, just briefly. I let myself have about 45 seconds and then I stopped. The second call was to Martin. Martin Bryce has been my lawyer for 12 years. He's a few years younger than me, semi-retired now, but he handled Raymond's estate and he knows every detail of my financial situation. He is one of the most precise, careful, clear-headed people I have ever known, and he is also a genuinely kind man, the kind who answers his mobile on a Sunday when he sees your name. "Patricia," he said immediately. "What's happened?" I told him. All of it. The 5 months, the money, the mug, the things she said about Raymond. Martin listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think you know what you need to do." "I do," I said. "I need to know if it will hold." He said he would take care of it. He asked if I was ready for the conversation that would come after. I said I thought I was. He said, "I'll be there at 10 on Sunday." I said I'd have his coffee waiting, the dark roast he likes, the one I keep on hand for him specifically. The third call was to my daughter's brother. Patrick is 42 and lives in Ottawa with his wife and 2 kids. He is not a dramatic person. He does not insert himself into things unnecessarily. But he is fair, deeply fair, and he loves his sister, and he loves me, and he had been watching the situation from a careful distance for months. When I told him what had happened that morning, I heard him exhale slowly, the way you exhale when something has finally landed that you'd been half dreading. "Mom," he said, "I should have come down sooner." "I don't want you to fix it," I said. "I want you to witness it. There's a difference." He was there by Saturday evening. That week I didn't say much to Sophie. She came and went. She seemed to have retreated into herself after Sunday morning. Chastened perhaps, or maybe just waiting for me to address it so she could defend herself. I didn't give her the opening. I was not cold. I was not warm either. I moved through the house doing the things I always did, gardening, cooking, my Tuesday reading group, and I carried myself the way my grandmother always told me to carry yourself when things are hard. Chin level, shoulders back, take up exactly the space that belongs to you. Saturday afternoon, Patrick arrived. I heard Sophie come downstairs when she heard his voice, and the conversation between them in the hallway was brief. She sounded surprised but not displeased to see him. She didn't know why he was there. That night I made dinner for the 3 of us, a proper roast chicken with roasted root vegetables and a wild rice pilaf, the kind of meal that says this household still functions. This kitchen still belongs to someone who cares about it. We talked about Patrick's children, about the drive from Ottawa, about the early spring. Sophie seemed lighter than she'd been in weeks. She laughed twice genuinely. I watched her and I felt the old love move through me, complicated and bruised, but still there. Still there. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark and I listened to the house settle and I thought about everything I was going to say in the morning. I thought about Raymond. I thought about the mug and the paper bag in the back of my closet where I'd put the broken pieces. I thought about my garden and how every spring I put seeds into ground that had been frozen and hard for months, and somehow they grew. I got up at 6. Patrick was already in the kitchen when I came down, nursing a coffee and looking out the back window at the garden. He turned when he heard me. "You sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure about what I'm not willing to keep living with," I said. "That's all I know." I baked scones. Brown butter and cardamom, the kind my mother made, the kind the smell of which can reach the second floor of a house and pull you downstairs without you even deciding to come. I set the table the way I set it for company, the blue linen cloth that had been a wedding gift, the good cups, the cream and sugar in the proper dishes. I put a small vase with early tulips from the garden in the center, yellow and white. At 9:45, the doorbell rang. Dorothy came first, in her good coat, carrying a small pot of her homemade strawberry jam, because Dorothy never arrives anywhere without bringing something. She looked at my face and then at the table and then at my face again, and she put her arms around me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she straightened up, and she looked like exactly what she was. A 64-year-old retired teacher who has spent 40 years watching people underestimate what a quiet woman is capable of. Martin arrived 2 minutes later. Dark coat, briefcase. that particular settled quality about him that courtrooms and difficult conversations seem to produce in certain people. He shook Patrick's hand. He looked at the table. He nodded once, approving. At 10, we all heard footsteps upstairs. The pause of someone registering that there are voices below. The longer pause of someone trying to decide whether to come down. Sophie came downstairs in her robe, her hair loose, expecting Sunday morning. She stopped in the doorway of the dining room and looked at the table and at the people sitting at it, and the confusion on her face moved through several expressions: quickly surprise, uncertainty, and then a wariness she tried to mask. "Good morning," she said. She looked at me. "Mom, what is this?" I was sitting at the head of my table, my good china in front of me, my hands folded, calm, still. "Come and sit down, Sophie," I said. "Have a scone. There's things we need to talk about, and I wanted people who care about us both to be here for the conversation." She sat down slowly. Patrick poured her coffee without being asked, a kind, ordinary gesture, the kind that reminds you what normal looks like. Martin opened his briefcase. He took out 2 folders and set them on the table beside his coffee cup. He didn't open them yet. There was a moment of quiet, the kind that has weight. Sophie looked around at the faces, at Dorothy, who she'd known her whole life, at Patrick, at Martin, who she knew was my lawyer, at me, and something shifted in her face. Not anger, not yet. More like the first recognition that the ground had changed beneath her feet, and she hadn't noticed. "I want to say something to you first," I said to my daughter, "before any of the other things. I want to say it because it's the most important thing, and I need you to hear it before anything else." She looked at me warily. "Okay," she said. "I love you," I told her. "I have loved you since before you were born, since you were no bigger than a walnut and already making my mornings difficult. I love you with the part of me that doesn't make decisions, the part that just exists, that doesn't require anything of you. That love is not on the table today. It's not something you can damage or lose." She swallowed. Her fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "But the last 5 months," I continued, "have been some of the hardest of my life. Harder than I admitted to myself until recently. And I need to be honest with you about that, because I think the alternative, staying quiet, absorbing it, pretending, is something I watched nearly destroy me once already when your father was sick and I tried to carry everything alone. I won't do that again. I'm 67 years old and I don't have the patience for silence that I used to have, and I've decided that's not a weakness." I could see Dorothy, across the table, keeping her expression steady. Patrick was looking at his hands. Sophie opened her mouth. "Mom, last weekend, I let her speak. She started to apologize, the way people apologize when they're sorry they got caught, sorry for the spectacle of it, sorry you're angry. She mentioned being stressed. She mentioned how hard the past year had been. She did not mention Raymond's mug. I waited until she stopped. Then I said, 'I know you've been through a great deal. I do know that. I watched it happen from right here in this house. And I have tried, Sophie. I have genuinely tried to be the kind of mother who gives without measuring, but there's a difference between generosity and erasure. And over these past months, I have been slowly erased. My routines interrupted. My friends discouraged from coming. My home rearranged. My grief treated like a character flaw. And last Sunday, your father's mug." She flinched. That one landed. "I have the pieces," I said quietly. "I'm going to have it repaired, but I needed you to know that I kept them, that I didn't just sweep it up and move on. Because moving on is what I've been doing every time, and this is the last time." Martin set his hand on one of the folders without opening it. He said, "Sophie, your mother asked me to come today because there are some practical matters that need to be addressed clearly and with everyone present." He spoke the way lawyers speak, precise, without hostility, without drama. He explained that as of Thursday, my will had been reviewed and updated. Something he said was straightforward and overdue given that 6 years had passed since Raymond's estate was settled. He didn't reveal the specifics, didn't need to. But the implication was clear. Things that had perhaps been assumed were no longer guaranteed. He also had, he said, a formal letter outlining the terms of Sophie's residence in my home, a proper agreement, not a suggestion, with a timeline and a financial contribution beginning in 30 days, consistent with fair market value for a room in Kingston. If she chose to stay under those terms, she was welcome. If she found other arrangements, there would be no hard feelings and no conditions placed on the relationship. He slid the folder across the table. Sophie looked at the folder, and then at me. There was a long silence, a complicated silence, full of things that would take years to fully sort through. "You planned this," she finally said. Her voice was not angry. It was something smaller than angry. It was shaken. "Yes," I said. "I've been planning it since Sunday morning when I was on my hands and knees picking up your father's mug off my kitchen floor." The silence came back. Dorothy reached across the table and poured more coffee into everyone's cup, an ordinary gesture that somehow steadied the room. Sophie looked at Patrick. He met her eyes steadily. He didn't say anything, but his expression said everything that a sibling's expression can say. "I'm here. I love you. And you know she's right." I watched my daughter's face in that moment. I won't pretend it wasn't one of the hardest things I have ever witnessed. I know that face better than any face in the world. I watched her be born into it. I watched it learn to smile, to read, to carry disappointment, to come back from things. I watched something crack open in it that Sunday morning, something that had been sealed shut and maybe needed to be opened. She reached out and pulled the folder toward herself without opening it. She kept her eyes down for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. "I don't want to lose you, Mom," she said. "I'm sorry. I don't know when I became this person. I don't know when I started taking everything out on you. You're the safest person I know, and I think I used that as a reason to be the worst version of myself around you." "I know," I said. "I know that's what happened, but Sophie, being safe for someone shouldn't mean being disposable to them. You understand what I'm saying?" She nodded. A small, careful nod. "I need you to get some help," I told her. "Not because there's something broken in you that needs to be fixed, but because you've been through real losses this past year and you haven't let anyone help you with them properly. You've just been standing in my kitchen being furious at me for being here. A therapist, Sophie. A good one. That's not negotiable." She didn't argue. That, more than anything else, told me something was shifting. Dorothy reached over and put her hand over Sophie's hand, a small, warm, entirely Dorothy gesture. Sophie looked at her and Dorothy said, in that plain and steady way she has, "You know, I saw you grow up. You were a remarkable kid. You still are, somewhere in there. Your mother knows that. That's why she did this in front of people instead of just quietly asking you to leave. Think about that." The morning moved forward. We ate the scones. Martin's were finished quickly. He's always had a weakness for cardamom. Patrick made more coffee. The tension didn't vanish, but it shifted into something that felt less like a courtroom and more like a family sitting with a hard truth, which is exactly what it was. Sophie took the folder upstairs with her when she went to get dressed. She came back an hour later, showered and quiet, and asked if she could speak to Martin alone for a few minutes. I gave them the living room. She stayed. Under the new terms, she took a room that was properly hers, with a contribution toward groceries and utilities, and a timeline for her own housing plan by the following September. She started seeing a therapist, a woman her own doctor recommended, someone who worked with people navigating career and identity transitions, and while she didn't tell me much about the sessions, I could feel, over the weeks and months that followed, a slow, incremental change. Less weather in the house, less of that low atmospheric pressure that had taken up residence in every room. She found a job in May, a smaller company than she'd had before, managing communications for a healthcare nonprofit in Kingston, not Toronto, not the salary she'd had, but work she seemed to genuinely care about. She told me about it over dinner one evening. A proper dinner that she had made, pasta with a sauce from scratch, set the table herself, poured me a glass of the white wine I like. "I like the people," she said. "That's new for me. Actually liking the people. That's worth a lot," I told her. "It is," she agreed. She moved into her own apartment in August, a one-bedroom in a building on Princess Street, walking distance from the library where I volunteer on Wednesday mornings. On her last evening in my house, we sat on the back porch after dinner in the long August light, 2 cups of tea going cold on the table between us. The garden was full and green, the hostas enormous, the tomatoes finely red. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to be honest with me. Go ahead. Were you ever afraid of me? Not physically. But did you ever feel like you didn't know how it was going to go when you heard me on the stairs?" I thought about that carefully before I answered, because she was asking for honesty, and she deserved it. Yes, I said. There were several months where I felt something like that. Not fear exactly. More like bracing. The way you brace before the weather. She looked at the garden for a long time. I'm sorry, she said finally. I'm sorry you felt that in your own house. I know you are, I said. And I believe you mean it. We didn't say much after that. We sat with the evening in the garden and the complicated, bruised, still-standing love between a mother and her daughter, and that was enough for now. Some repairs take longer than others. The blue mug is back on the shelf, 3 thin lines of gold lacquer tracing the cracks where it broke, a Japanese technique I'd read about somewhere. The idea that what has been broken and repaired is not diminished but marked, that the mending itself is part of what the thing now is. Raymond would have liked that, I think. He was a man who understood that the things worth keeping are not the things that were never damaged. They're the things that were damaged and held together anyway. My name is Patricia Wellett. I'm 67 years old. I live in a red brick house in Kingston, Ontario. And last April, I sat at the head of my own table and said, clearly and in front of witnesses, this is my home, and this is my life, and I am not done with either of them. And I meant every word. If you've ever been through something like this, with a child, a grandchild, anyone you loved who you also had to draw a hard line with, I'd really like to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what city you're in. Tell me whether you think I did the right thing. And if this story meant something to you, please give it a like. It helps me keep sharing stories like this one. Thank you for being here.